There's a very specific moment that reliably breaks a narcissist's confidence more than any argument, any confrontation, any tearful accusation ever could. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the moment they realize you've genuinely stopped needing anything from them at all. And somehow this is exactly the moment they suddenly, urgently want you back. If this has happened to you, you already know how disorienting it is. You spent months, maybe years, trying everything to get their attention, their consistency, their genuine presence, and none of it worked. Then you stopped trying. You detached, not as a strategy, but because you were finally, truly done. And almost immediately, the same person who couldn't be bothered to show up for you suddenly reappears, suddenly interested, suddenly saying all the things you once desperately wanted to hear. Today, we're going to explain exactly why this happens, what detachment actually does to a narcissist's psychology, and why understanding this mechanism is going to change how you interpret every sudden return that follows a period of genuine distance. Let's start with what detachment actually is, because it's frequently misunderstood, even by people who are doing it correctly. Detachment isn't coldness. It isn't punishment. It isn't a strategic, silent treatment designed to make someone chase you. If it's being used that way, it isn't actually detachment at all. It's just another version of the same push-pull dynamic that was already exhausting you. Genuine detachment is something quieter and much more internal. It's the state of no longer needing a specific outcome from a specific person in order to feel okay. You stop waiting for the apology. You stop hoping the next conversation will finally be different. You stop orienting your emotional well-being around whether they're going to respond, engage, or validate what you're feeling. This shift happens internally, often gradually, and it has almost nothing to do with performing indifference for their benefit. Here's why this internal shift is so uniquely destabilizing to a narcissist, more destabilizing than almost anything else you could do. We've talked before about how a narcissist's sense of self is regulated externally, dependent on a continuous stream of attention, admiration, and emotional reactivity from the people around them to feel stable and coherent. This means every relationship a narcissist maintains functions, whether either person names it this way or not, as a kind of ongoing psychological transaction. You provide the emotional reactivity, anger, hurt, hope, anxiety, any strong reaction at all, and in exchange they receive proof that they still matter, that they still have power, that their presence in your life still produces something significant. Genuine detachment removes your side of that transaction entirely. Not through refusal, not through a dramatic declaration that you're done providing it, but simply because the underlying need to provide it has actually structurally disappeared. And this is the crucial distinction that explains why detachment works so differently than every other response you might have tried before. A narcissist has an entire toolkit built to handle anger, hurt, even outright rejection, because all of those responses still involve you being emotionally engaged with them. What they don't have a toolkit for is genuine indifference, because indifference isn't a response to manage. It's an absence of anything to respond to at all. This is worth understanding at a deeper level because it explains the specific psychological mechanism behind why detachment triggers such a strong reaction. When you were still emotionally reactive, even angrily, even painfully reactive, the narcissist's psyche could still locate itself in relation to you. Your anger confirmed they still had the power to provoke a reaction. Your hurt confirmed they still mattered enough to cause pain. Your hope, however painful it was for you to keep holding on to, confirmed that some part of you still believed they were capable of being the person you originally fell for. All of these responses, painful as they were for you, gave the narcissist something stable to locate themselves against. Genuine detachment removes that entirely. There's no anger to provoke a defensive reaction, no hurt to leverage into guilt, no hope left to manipulate with false promises of change. What's left from the narcissist's perspective is something they've likely never had to face directly in this relationship before: total structural irrelevance to your emotional state. And irrelevance, for a psyche organized entirely around needing to matter, registers as something close to an existential threat. This is why the timing of a narcissist's sudden return so often lines up with almost eerie precision to the exact moment your detachment becomes genuine rather than performed. Many empaths notice this pattern without fully understanding why it happens. They spent months trying to get a reaction, a resolution, any sign of genuine care, and got nothing. Then, once they finally stopped trying, stopped hoping, stopped checking, the narcissist reappeared almost as if summoned by the shift itself. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't some mystical, energetic phenomenon either, despite how it might feel in the moment. It's a direct, predictable psychological response to losing something their entire internal regulation system depended on without them ever consciously realizing how much they depended on it. Here's what's important to understand about what's actually happening inside them during this moment, because it explains why their sudden interest often feels disturbingly more intense and more convincing than anything they offered during the entire relationship. When a narcissist senses genuine detachment, they're not experiencing simple romantic longing. They're experiencing something closer to a regulatory crisis. The sudden, urgent recognition that a source of psychological stability they'd taken completely for granted has actually permanently disappeared. This urgency produces behavior that can look remarkably like genuine desperation, genuine vulnerability, sometimes even genuine tears, because on some level, something in them really is in crisis. The mistake many empaths make in this moment is interpreting that crisis as evidence of real love finally surfacing, when what's actually surfacing is the panic of losing a regulatory function, dressed up in the language and behavior of romantic desperation, because that's the only framework either of you has ever used to describe this relationship. This is worth sitting with carefully, because it's the piece that determines whether you interpret this moment correctly or get pulled back into a cycle you already worked so hard to escape. The intensity of a narcissist's sudden return after genuine detachment can feel, viscerally, like the most convincing evidence you've ever received that they truly love you, truly regret what happened, truly understand now what they never seemed to understand before. And I want to be honest with you about why it feels that way, because understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish how real the feeling is on your end. It simply clarifies what's actually producing it on theirs. The intensity feels convincing because it genuinely is intense in the sense that something real is happening inside them. What's misleading isn't the intensity itself, it's the interpretation of what that intensity actually means. A regulatory crisis and genuine romantic longing can produce remarkably similar external behavior. Urgent messages, tearful declarations, promises of change, an apparent depth of feeling that seems, on the surface, indistinguishable from real love finally breaking through years of defensive walls. But the internal experience driving each of these is fundamentally different, and that difference becomes visible, reliably, once you look past the intensity itself and toward what actually happens after the initial crisis passes. Here's the test that separates genuine change from regulatory panic, and it's one of the most reliable tools you'll ever have for evaluating a sudden return like this. Does the intensity sustain itself once your detachment doesn't budge, or does it fade the moment it becomes clear that the crisis isn't going to produce the result they're hoping for? Regulatory panic is, by its very nature, responsive to your reaction. It escalates when you engage, even slightly, because engagement suggests the strategy is working. It fades, often quite quickly when your detachment holds firm, regardless of how intense or convincing the approach becomes, because without the payoff of your renewed emotional engagement, there's nothing left to sustain the urgency that produced the behavior in the first place. Genuine change, by contrast, doesn't depend on your response to keep going. It exists and sustains itself, whether or not you engage with it at all, because it was never actually about restoring access to you specifically. It was about becoming, internally, a different kind of person. Work that continues regardless of the outcome. This is why maintaining your detachment through the intensity of a sudden return is so critically important, even though it's genuinely one of the hardest things you'll ever be asked to do. Every instinct you have, especially if you're an empath who's spent a lifetime responding to emotional intensity with immediate compassion, will push you toward engaging with what looks like real vulnerability, real crisis, real need. But engaging at this exact moment doesn't just risk reopening the relationship. It actively teaches the narcissist's psychology something important. That detachment, even when it seems genuine, eventually breaks under enough pressure. This lesson, once reinforced, doesn't just affect this specific attempt at reconnection, it fundamentally undermines the power of detachment as a boundary going forward, because it confirms definitively that even your most genuine internal shifts can eventually be reversed with enough intensity, enough apparent vulnerability, enough well-timed pressure applied at exactly the right moment. Let's talk about what happens if your detachment does hold, because this is the piece almost nobody gets to witness, since by the time it happens, most empaths have already wisely distanced themselves enough that they're no longer watching closely. When genuine detachment holds through the intensity of a sudden return, without wavering, without a single moment of re-engagement, something significant happens inside the narcissist's psychology that goes beyond simple disappointment. The regulatory crisis that triggered the sudden return doesn't resolve, because the thing that would resolve it, your renewed emotional engagement, never arrives. This means the crisis has to resolve some other way, and the way it typically resolves is through exactly the defense mechanisms we've discussed in earlier videos: devaluation, narrative reconstruction, a rapid pivot toward finding a replacement source of the regulation your detachment made permanently unavailable. Here's what's worth understanding clearly about this outcome, because it might initially sound discouraging. Yes, in most cases, a narcissist whose attempt to reverse your detachment fails will eventually redirect toward someone else, constructing whatever story is necessary to protect themselves from having to sit honestly with what your unwavering detachment actually proved. This is disappointing if you're hoping for a different ending, one where your strength finally produces genuine accountability and lasting change. But here's the reframe that matters most. Your detachment was never actually about producing that outcome in the first place. It was never a strategy designed to finally make them understand, finally make them change, finally prove your worth was significant enough to transform them into someone capable of the relationship you always deserved. That was never available through any strategy, no matter how perfectly executed. What your detachment actually produces, regardless of what they do with the crisis it creates in them, is something entirely within your own reach. Proof to yourself that you're capable of holding a boundary even when the pull to abandon it is at its absolute strongest. This is the piece worth carrying forward more than anything else in this entire story, because it reframes the whole purpose of detachment from something aimed at them into something that was always actually for you. The power of detachment was never really about what it does to a narcissist, even though understanding that mechanism helps you make sense of their behavior and protects you from being blindsided by it. The real power of detachment is what it proves about your own capacity, that you can build a version of yourself whose stability doesn't depend on someone else's response, whose sense of worth doesn't require their acknowledgement to feel complete. whose boundaries hold not because you're punishing anyone, but because you've finally genuinely stopped needing anything from a source that was never reliably capable of providing it. I want to address something honestly here because it's easy for a story like this one to slide into something that sounds like a strategy for winning a narcissist back through reverse psychology, and that was never the point. And using it that way will backfire in ways worth naming clearly. If your detachment is secretly a performance held in place specifically because you're hoping it will produce exactly the sudden return we've just described, you're not actually detached. You're running a more sophisticated version of the same pursuit, just disguised as its opposite. A narcissist's psychology, remember, is exceptionally attuned to detecting whether engagement is still available underneath a performance of distance, and performed detachment held together by the secret hope of provoking a reaction will almost always crack the moment that reaction actually arrives, precisely because the hope was still there the whole time, waiting for exactly this outcome to validate it. Genuine detachment doesn't work this way, and it can't be manufactured as a technique aimed at producing a specific result. It has to be real, built through the slow, difficult, often painful process of fully grieving what the relationship actually was, releasing the hope that it could have been something different, and rebuilding your sense of self around sources that don't depend on this person's participation at all. This is why detachment, done honestly, tends to take much longer to develop than most people expect, and why trying to rush or fake it usually just produces a more elaborate version of the same waiting you were already exhausted by. Here's what's genuinely worth understanding about the sudden return itself. Once you've built detachment that's actually real rather than strategic, it stops mattering nearly as much as you might expect it to. This is one of the strangest, most unexpected outcomes of genuine detachment, and it's worth naming clearly because it contradicts what you might assume going into this process. You'd think that finally understanding why a narcissist suddenly wants you back after real distance would make their return feel more significant, more validating, more worth paying attention to. In practice, the opposite tends to happen. Once your detachment is genuine, once your sense of worth and stability no longer depends on their response at all, their sudden reappearance becomes almost unremarkable. Information about their internal state rather than a referendum on yours noted and then set aside, rather than something requiring careful analysis of what it might mean or whether it changes anything about your decision to stay away. This is the actual destination this entire process is pointing toward, more than any specific outcome involving them. Not detachment as a clever tool for producing a particular reaction, and not detachment as evidence you can eventually point to as proof of your own power over their behavior. Detachment as a genuine internal state where their actions, whether that's silence, sudden warmth, devaluation, or eventual redirection toward someone new, simply stop being information you need in order to know how to feel about your own life. That state, once genuinely built, is permanent in a way nothing about their behavior ever could be, because it doesn't depend on anything they do next. It only depends on what you've already quietly, completely become. If you're in the middle of building this right now, watching a sudden return unfold in front of you, feeling the old pull toward engagement, wondering whether this time might actually be different, I want you to trust the distinction we've walked through today more than you trust the intensity of what's arriving. Genuine change sustains itself without your engagement. Regulatory panic doesn't. Let the difference reveal itself over time without needing to resolve it in the emotionally charged moment their sudden interest first appears. Your detachment doesn't need to answer that question immediately. It only needs to hold quietly for as long as it takes the truth to become undeniable on its own. They may come back with more intensity than they ever offered while you were still there, still trying, still hoping they'd finally show up the way you needed them to. That intensity was never actually available to you when you needed it most. It only appeared once you stopped needing it at all, which tells you, more clearly than anything else in this story, exactly what it was actually about the whole time. Not you, never quite you, only ever what your absence finally made undeniable to them about themselves. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, then like, share, and subscribe my channel for more videos.